Hello, horse racing fans, and welcome to a pilot episode of something completely different. I've covered the Kentucky Derby in quite extensive detail, so forgive me for not being in such a rush to cover the Preakness or the Belmont. Yeah, the Preakness has lots of big news, with Secret Oath trying to take on the boys for a second time, and Rich Strike becoming the first horse since Grindstone to skip the Preakness Stakes after winning the Kentucky Derby. But why not do something else? Why not talk about something that's not related to the Triple Crown? Why not talk about movies? I know that wasn't really a good segue, but what's important here is that that's what I want to talk about today, and start doing. I want to talk about horse movies. Now, discussing horse movies isn't something completely unfamiliar to this YouTube channel. I've done it before, but I haven't ever made a direct review of a horse movie before, and the inspiration for starting it was thanks to this comment by Nicholas Lane Landingham on my 10 Inaccuracies of Seabiscuit video, which he suggested making one on Hidalgo. And I thought about it, and I looked into it, and then I realized it's harder to find 5 things that are actually true about Hidalgo, since that film it's fiction. There's no true story here. It's all a bunch of fake stories written in a diary by some guy, which over 100 years after it was written became a movie starring Viggo Mortensen, which we're going to be reviewing today. Now, if you're going to go into this movie thinking that this is going to be a harrowing true story and a biopic, then you've come to see the wrong movie. But, if you treat this as a fictional period piece that happens to be set in 1890, things become a lot better and it's a lot easier to enjoy the movie. And that's how we're going to be criticizing and also praising this movie as. So without further ado, let's start reviewing this movie. So far, the current formula that we're going to be starting with this series is briefly synopsizing its story, and then talking about what I liked and don't liked about the movie. And these will be full of spoilers. Like, if you haven't watched these movies already, then don't watch this video. But if you have, then you know the story of Hidalgo. The movie starts out by introducing us to our two pals, Frank Hopkins and his titular wild Mustang, as they win an 1,100-mile race. And that's kind of all we get when it comes to establishing his record as the greatest endurance horse and rider. After this, the rest of the opening is mainly dedicated to the Wounded Knee Massacre, which he feels partially responsible for because he gives the message which gives the 7th Cavalry Regiment the authorization to start it, and because he is half Lakota, he feels very guilty. This leads him to start drinking. A lot. And this doesn't really help his Buffalo Bills Wild West show that he's a part of, because when you're drunk, you don't ride very well. However, Frank has to get out of his drunken stupor a bit quicker than he wants when an attached for Sheik Riyad approaches them and tells them to remove their title as the greatest endurance horse and rider, or to prove themselves in the 3,000-mile Ocean of Fire, which traditionally was an Arabian-bred exclusive race with all the best purebred Arabians in it, including Al Hattal, who is the main horse to beat throughout this movie. However, they've decided to make an exception and give Hidalgo the chance to face off against these purebreds, which is a running theme throughout the movie as a lot of people hold prejudice towards Hidalgo for being a Mustang, or an impure horse, as well as that while this is going on, Mustangs are being rounded up and killed by the government, so there's a secret underlying motive to win the race, which is to help the Mustangs and to also prove a point. Which for Frank is to not be ashamed of his mixed heritage, and for Hidalgo it's to prove that Mustangs are just as capable as any purebred horse. And now with our stakes established, Frank Hopkins accepts the challenge and gets on the boat en route to the Arabian desert. There, he meets Anne Davenport, who's one of the villains of the movie. Her main motivation throughout the movie is that she wants to breed her mare, Camria, to Al Hattal, because Al Hattal is a part of the greatest bloodline of endurance horses in the world, but the only way she can get there is if her horse wins the race, and she will do almost anything to make sure that she wins that race, whether that means trying to seduce our main character into defecting from the race, or if that doesn't work, bribing other people to set up spear-filled death traps to try and kill his horse. But all that stuff happens when the actual race begins, which is surprisingly early into the movie, only 40 minutes in and the horses are off and racing, and this race becomes an overarching event that lasts the final 2/3 of this movie. In the meantime, the main characters also have a couple of detours, which include rescuing people, shooting people, spear pits, wild leopards. Yeah, how is this based off a true story again? And then we got a grand finale, where Frank Hopkins questions whether he should shoot Hidalgo in the head to put him out of his misery, or to continue the race. But, with some hallucinations and some trash talk from his rival, he gets back into it, rides bareback with some pretty obvious continuity errors, which are kinda laughable. But by the end of it, he wins, it's a Disney movie, it's a foregone conclusion, and then with that money, he's able to free all the Mustangs and eventually Hidalgo himself, which is definitely the most emotional scene in the movie, and a great conclusion to a solid movie. So now let's get into what I do and don't like about it. Because the movie is rated PG-13 rather than PG, Hidalgo is able to have a lot more intense sequences than your usual horse movie, mainly in its fighting, my favorite of which definitely being the rescuing of Jazeera. Jazeera is the daughter of the Sheik, and she gets captured by Khatib, who wants to hold a ransom for Al-Hatal. But instead of forcing the Sheik to choose between his daughter and his prize stallion, instead we get Frank and a couple of other characters teaming up to rescue Jazeera with a pretty simple but honestly pretty cool operation, where instead they paint a normal horse to look like Al-Hatal and then cover him in a blanket. Then when the ruse is up, they make their daring rescue, although not unscathed. It has a lot of cool parts in it, such as showing off Jazeera's horsemanship, which has been alluded to throughout the course of the movie, and we finally get to see it. As well as that, it's pretty cool to see Hidalgo show off some of his tricks, such as being able to untie his own knot. In general, a lot of side characters get their best moment to shine in this scene, and it's just kinda cool seeing Hidalgo navigate through this tiny town as they daringly get out. And there's definitely other cool action sequences in this movie, however, there's more to praise about it. Mainly the cinematography, which I think shines the most during the silhouette scenes throughout the movie. Over the course of the long journey, there are quite a few long shots where you just see Frank and Hidalgo trek through the dark desert night, and all you can see is their shadows as the sun slowly sets. And while some people might consider these scenes a little boring and long, I think they're quite necessary, because this isn't your usual 2-minute Kentucky Derby race. This is a 3,000-mile race that takes over 2 months to complete. During that, it isn't always going to be action and racing towards the finish line. Sometimes it's just going to be a long, arduous trek through the desert with no one in sight for miles, except you and your horse. And that factor definitely helps strengthen Frank and Hidalgo's bond without the need for words. You don't just see them guns blazing into a thrilling action sequence, you see their journey warts and all. You see Hidalgo carrying Frank's sleeping body as he can barely stay awake, you see them eat dead locusts, and you see them just walking up and down sand dunes as the sun slowly sets, with their only company being themselves. And I find that beautiful. It also doesn't hurt that these are definitely the best lit sequences in the movie, and who doesn't like a good silhouette shot every once in a while? It also shows that the Arabian desert isn't just a dry and merciless place, it can also be a thing of beauty. And that's where my praises for the movie kinda come to an end. There's a bunch of other stuff that's pretty nice about the film, but those are the main highlights. Now we get into the parts that I think could have been done a bit better. Despite the film having a pretty legitimate runtime of 2 hours and 15 minutes, there are still parts of the movie that I feel got overlooked or are just there and barely mentioned. Mainly Frank T. Hopkins' legacy before the movie starts, as well as the general severity of the desert. What I mean by this is that Frank T. Hopkins only has one other race in the movie. Now, I'm not saying that we should have had 2 races in the movie or anything, but I feel like a quick montage of him winning other races would have done a lot of good to establish that he is a legitimate rider, as the one opening scene doesn't really do that justice, as instead we focus more on his drunken stoop. And this kinda hurts the movie when we're considering that this is their last great adventure together as horse and rider before Hidalgo is released into the wild, so it could have definitely helped if we had a better pre-establishment of what they've already been through. Not just a brief snippet of one race they went through together and some drunken antics. It's implied that they've done a lot more, so I think a brief montage would have, at most, added only 5 minutes to the movie's runtime and better established their relationship. As well as that, even though the severity of the desert is definitely portrayed in quite a few scenes, there are quite a few parts that are surprisingly overlooked. Now, when you think about surviving in the desert, the biggest challenge you usually come up with is water. That's usually what everyone thinks, right? Well, none of the characters in the movie die from dehydration or even show any signs of at all being malnourished. All the characters that die are shot to death or stabbed. Now, they certainly tell you that it's important to stay hydrated for both you and your horse, but you never actually see it. They just tell you that right to your face and just expect you to go along with it. So it kind of diminishes its severity when you never see anyone go through those challenges. As well as that, Hidalgo, in some brief bits of dialogue, is implied to be past his prime and also suffering from minor injuries such as quarter cracks. However, throughout the film, he treks through the desert just fine with no ailment, and because of that, the only time that he ever shows any legitimate struggle to finish the race is after he gets impaled in the chest with a spear, which is pretty extreme to say the least. It gives off the implication that if it weren't for that booby trap, he would have finished the race just fine with minimal difficulty. If they had shown in previous scenes that things like those quarter cracks or dehydration were actually playing legitimate roles in Hidalgo being able to finish the race before he got stabbed, then I think those lines would have had a lot more of an effect. But because of that, they just kind of feel unnecessary and wouldn't have changed anything if they were removed from the movie. So while there are definitely good examples of visual storytelling throughout this movie, when it comes to certain obstacles, they kind of forgot the saying show don't tell, and so things like quarter cracks and dehydration definitely feel less severe than they were supposed to be. And with that, we can now make our final review. Hidalgo stands on its own 4 feet for its unique genre and take on a horse racing movie, with it being a long distance race instead, something you don't see all the time. It's definitely full of more action than most racing movies, which also is a great thing to see, and the lighting in certain shots is absolutely impeccable. However, there are definitely bits of subtlety that could have definitely improved the film, such as better establishing Hidalgo and Frank's relationship, and also adding more scenes for things like dehydration, rather than just telling you that it's important. And for that, I would give Hidalgo a 7.5 out of 10. And for that rating, it gets 3 horseshoes out of 4, which is, I guess, my unique rating system. I'll tweak it over the next couple of episodes, but for now, this is our established formula. Hope you guys enjoyed this pilot episode, and comment down if you want me to review other horse movies like this. I really want to continue doing this. In the meantime, see you guys on the flip side.